Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So here we are in Parshat Mishpatim, and here we're talking about bestiality. Kol shochev im behema mot yumat. Anyone who lies with a beast shall surely be put to death. I do want to say that even though they certainly did have the concept of capital punishment, nevertheless, the Talmud, when you look at the tractate Sanhedrin, it discusses the safety measures that need to take place before anyone is actually executed, and that there have to be a court of, I believe it is, I'm trying to think now, that it is like 31 possibly, or 36, that number of judges that have to discuss it. If the court is unanimous in a decision to execute, the assumption is that the person did not get a vigorous enough defense, and he is not executed. There are all kinds of safety measures, as I said, to try and give the person a chance to defend themselves. At any rate, here we have this. And so the reason I think primarily for seeing these is to tell us that these are actually very important principles, even though our own instinct might be to not consider them so important. So here we go with the Rashi. So the fact that this is in parentheses, notice here, is that it's possible, and the Samach Aleph stands for Svarim Acherim. It stands for different books, other manuscripts, etc. So that apparently in studying these various versions, and by the way, there's a whole discipline in terms of trying to determine how accurate as possible, a version that you have is to examine different manuscripts that are deposited in various libraries, like the Vatican has a library. I believe the University of, is it Oxford, possibly the Bodleian Library. But there's a library in Munich that has very ancient manuscripts and also very early editions, very early printed editions, and to compare them and to see how exactly they match one to another. And so we have at times what are called critical texts, where there's a device at the bottom which tells you the various versions that exist and where they exist and how they exist. At any rate, here we have this Kol shochev im behema mot yumat. That is exactly what we have here in the text here. But here's the part. It says beskila, right? That this person is executed by stoning. And I want to make it very clear that stoning does not mean standing in the center of a ring of angry people who are throwing stones at him. Any capital punishment is not something that's pleasant, but I can tell you that in this particular case, the person was first of all strangled, so that he was unconscious when this was actually taking place, and at that point the body was thrown over the edge of a cliff, and then a heavy stone was dropped on him. And that's essentially the way this took place. And I believe that it was understood that doing it in this particular way totally cleared this person of any guilt, so that when he entered the next life, he would, or she in this case, and this is a point that Rashi makes, would be clear of any guilt as they moved into the next life. So goes on to say, Rover Kenirbaat, one who copulated, like just the same as one who was the one who was copulated with, Shekatuv Bahem Dmehem Bam. How do we know this? How do we know that whether it's a male or a female, this applies? Because there are certainly uh, some infractions where it only applies, that one infraction, or at least the punishment, is different depending on the gender of the person. But it says here in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 15, Demehem, their blood guilt is upon them. And the fact that it's bam and not damo, bo, it doesn't say his blood is on his head. The fact is that it occurs whether it's male or female. And here's the verse in Leviticus 20. There's a parallel law here. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, the man shall be put to death, and you shall kill the animal. So there it says, normally if it just says put to death, it generally means strangulation. That's it. But because it goes on to say, if a woman goes up to any amount to mate with it, you shall kill the woman and the animal. They shall both be put to death. Their blood guilt is upon them, and their blood guilt is upon them is understood as referring both to the man and the woman. And the reason why the animal is killed is that the animal might be identified if it went around people seeing the animal and they would say, oh, that's the animal that so-and-so had relations with. And both in terms of the animal and the person, once they've paid their price, that's it. And so the animal is killed not because it is guilty itself, but as a way of trying to clear the air and to say this person has fully paid for their debt to society and to God, and this does not need to continue. But that's the reason the animal's put to death. So let's see if there's anything else. Nope, we're going to go on. Sover la Elohim. Notice this, the way in which this is phrased, right? One who offers a sacrifice, essentially, right, to God's small g here. Although we use the term Elohim for God, nevertheless, here it means to God's small g. It does not mean God, the God of Abraham. It does not mean that. And that has to do with the punctuation there. And Rashi is going to give us a major discussion about the grammar here. Yehoram, right, shall be cut off, literally, or excommunicated. Bilti Lashem Levado, with the exception of the Lord by himself, meaning that is the only one we can worship, right? We can act in that worshipful kind of way. Let's take a look here now at the Rashi. So, Lelohim, right? So La Elohim is the point. There's no dots in this text. There's no pointing in this text. And so we have to try and just understand from the context. So here he says, La'avodat kochavim. It means essentially to an idol. That La Elohim means to an idol. And now he goes on to say, Ilu haya nakud. I believe he's saying Le'Elohim. But were this pointed not La Elohim, but Le'Elohim, right? Then he clarifies these. This is in here to clarify halamed, that the lamed, this lamed here, but seirei is with the sound of an a. Here is a seirei. This vowel here is called a seirei. It's an a sound. In other words, if it said Le'Elohim, it didn't say La Elohim, hayat tzarich lefaresh. It would have to be explicit. Velichtov acherim. It would have had to say Le'Elohim, and it would have to have the word acherim, meaning other. Okay, so Le'Elohim acherim would mean to other gods, as opposed to, we would not think that if it didn't have acherim, we might think it included God. Achshav, but now, she'amar la Elohim. But now, because it says la Elohim, ein tzarich lefaresh acherim, we no longer have to say that we're talking about other gods. It's understood. And going on now deeper, shekol lamed ubeit vehei, because any lamed or bet, the letter bet or hey, these are all prefixes that are pronouns. So the la means two or four. The bet b in front of a word has to do when it's used as a utility letter. It means in or with, and the hey is the definite article. It means the, right? The. So here we go. Ha mishamshot, in other words, are used as a utility letter. And by utility letter, I mean as opposed to the root of the word itself. But see, here's the barosh, and here it means at the beginning. So the rosh is the root word, and the b is now in a utility place. So it right in the beginning or at the beginning, ha teva. Here's the ha, right, and there it also here it means the at the beginning or in the beginning of a word of the word. Im nekuda bechataf, if there was a chataf, and the chataf means ritzonu lomar b'sheva. Sheva, actually, there's an English word, schwa, that has the same meaning. Essentially, it means an sound, right? So here, do you see these two dots vertical right here? That is a sheva. Interestingly enough, it is a combined letter. It's pronounced but it actually is only pronounced as an because the aleph is a guttural letter. And so normally we don't say so instead, because it's hard to say that, this is called a chataf, and this vowel is called a segol, an sound. So it's called a chataf segol. And of course, this is a shava. And that's why sometimes Rashi is referring to it as a chataf, but we normally, when it's by itself, we call it a shava. Here it is, shava, right? So here in the Aramaic, hit tail, see the sound. So without trying to get way too complicated, there are times when the shava is simply marks the end of a syllable, as in yit, and when it opens a syllable, it's pronounced as an So, so he gives an example. Kagon, for example, lemelech, to a king. So there, when it's right, it means the indefinite article, le midbar, to a wilderness, le'ir, to a city. Tzarich, because it's saying a and it's definite, and it was saying a city, right? Tzarich lefaresh, we would need to clarify le'eze melech, which king. If we're saying to a king, we don't know which king, because that's exactly the point of the indefinite article, right? Which king, le'eze midbar, what wilderness, le'eze ir, to which city, V'chein lim lachim. Now notice, instead of el melachim, it's lim lachim, and it has to do with this letter here. So lim lachim v'lir galim. So there it's, and again, that's a chirik, an e sound. You notice the e. So here's the chirik, right? That's the one dot underneath. Here's another chirik here, right? Here's another chirik. These are pronounced, they're called that, but the pronunciation is an e, right? And here it is, the chirik. Tzarich lefaresh. And again, even though it's not a shava, Rashi's just being a little bit more rigorous and telling us that there are times when instead of shava, the rules of grammar required to be a chirik when it's in these situations, right? Tzarich lefaresh. We need to clarify, we need to specify le'eza, which one. Ve'im eino mefaresh, right? However, if it doesn't tell you which king, then it means kol melachim. It's talking about all the kings. B'mashma, that's the implication. V'chein, right? Le'Elohim, v'tzerei here, right? What's atzerei? Let me see if I can find one. There's atzerei right here. You see that it's the a sound. Shochev, right? Behema. So he says, if it says Le'Elohim, Kol Elohim b'mashma. In that case, it refers to any God, right? Any ultimate object of worship. B'mashma is implied. Afilu kadosh. He's saying it includes even God, capital G. but Lelohim means gods, and it could include God. Aval keshehi nekuda patach, but when it is vocalized with a patach here is a patach here, right? It's just that's what's called a patach. It's an ah sound. Here's another patach right here. Here's another patach, right? Look at that, right? It's the ah sound. Let me find the place, right? Kamo la melech, to, and here the ah is like la ha, to the king, la midbar, to the wilderness or to the desert, la ir, to the city. So now we're talking about a definite article, the definite article. So in other words, when we're talking about the, generally we're talking about an object that, or a noun that has been discussed already. Patach v'kamatz inyan echad. He's saying whether it is a patach, this is a kamatz here. They're two different vowels, but they both have the sounds of an ah, right? Inyan echad. He says it has the same meaning, but inyan zeh, when it comes to this matter. V'gam yesh lomar, right? And you can also say b'derech acher, in another way, right? Kamosh Katuv B'digtuke Rashi. This appears to be an editorial comment, and my understanding here, when it says Diktuke Rashi, it would mean when Rashi is discussing grammatical points, right? And in another way, as is written in some area where Rashi is commenting grammatically, and he says, Ien bo, he says, take a look. Now, Diktuke Rashi could be a collection, a book that is a collection of Rashi's grammatical comments. And so when he says Ien bo, take a look at it, that he is referring to some collection or book of Rashi's grammatical points. Noda be'eze melech medaber. Then, if it's saying la, then we automatically know which king he's talking about. It's la melech, right? V'chein la'ir. If it says to the city, noda be'eze ir medaber, we're going to know exactly what. It doesn't need to tell us. We know what city it's talking about. V'chein, right? Le Elohim, and he's saying here where it's la, and there's where the kamatz, this is a kamatz, has the same function as a patach, right? V'chein la Elohim. In other words, it's a reference to the gods, meaning le'otan shehis hartem alehem. In other words, to those gods concerning which I have warned you. I've warned you not to worship. That's why it's to the gods, b'makom acher, in another place. So, all right. Keyotzebo, he's going on, he says, likewise, in Psalm 86, it says, Ein kamocha ba Elohim, and there's the ah underneath the ba. Remember, ba is one of those prefixes that Rashi mentioned earlier on. So it says, there is no one like you among the gods, Adonai, O Lord, ve'ein k'ma'asecha, and it is nothing like your deeds, right? So, Ein kamocha ba Elohim, lefi shelo piresh, because it doesn't tell you which Elohim, utzrach lihnaked bepatach. Therefore, it has to be vocalized with a patach, and even though it isn't actually a patach, it's actually a kamatz. He's already told us that the patach is the usual way in which a ha, right in the definite article, is expressed grammatically. Here, because it precedes a guttural letter, it's vocalized with the kamatz. So Yochoram shall be cut off. And he says what it means is put to death. Right? That's what it does mean. Belama ne'emar Yochoram. So why doesn't it say that? Why doesn't it say that? V'halo kvar ne'emara bo mita. And we already know, right, that such a person needs to be put to death. B'makom acher, in a different place. That other place is Deuteronomy chapter 17. That's where we read about someone who worships an idol. It's a capital offense. V'hutz et ha'ish, it says there in Deuteronomy, so probably v'hutzeta et ha'ish, you shall take that person out, hahu, that man, or et ha'isha hahi, or that woman, v'gomer, etc. But so there it tells you. So why does it use a different word here? Ella lefi shelo piresh al ezo avodah, but because here, right, it doesn't tell you what exactly, what kind of worship we're talking about, right? Chayav mita, he is a capital offense. In other words, there are various ways in which one can worship an idol, and it doesn't tell you precisely which way we're talking about or which ways. Shelo tomar, you shouldn't therefore say kol avodot b'mita, right? So you shouldn't say that any way in which a person worships an idol is a capital offense. You shouldn't say that. Ba upiresh lachakan, and for that reason it comes and specifies to you here Zovech lelohim yocharam. So here it's saying, so in the Deuteronomy passage, it doesn't tell you what kind of worship we're talking about. Here it's specific, right? It's saying one who offers a sacrifice to a god shall be cut off, right? Shall or excommunicated, but let's say cut off. Lomar, to tell you, lacha, to tell you, ma zevichat avodah haneset bifnim, that just we're going to extrapolate, and we're saying that any kind of worship of a god, right, is done inside, right, lashamayim, to heaven, bifnim lashamayim, af ani, in other words, in a temple, within a temple, af ani marbe. So I'm going to include, he says, the Lord's going to include hamaktir, one who burns incense, haminasech, one who offers libations, shehein avodot bifnim, because they are the kinds of services that take place within the temple, v'chayavin alehin, and so when they carry with it a capital punishment, l'chol avodat kochavim, to any idol, Bein shedarcha la'avda b'chach, whether or not that is the normal way in which the worship is practiced. Bein she'ein darcha la'avoda b'chach, or la'avda b'chach, whether or not it isn't the normal way in which this idol is worshipped. Aval she'ar avodot. So whether it's normally worshipped in that way, whether it isn't, if it is a worship that takes place within a temple, right? Then it bears with it the capital punishment. Aval she'ar avodot, but other ways in which one might be serving this idol, kagon, and he gives examples. Hamechabed, one who sweeps in front of it, right, who cleans the place. Vahamar merabetz, and one who sprinkles water, right. In other words, basically to limit the dust, etc. Hamegafef, and one who hugs it, even hugs it. All right, let's keep going. V'hamenashek, or kisses it, eino b'mita. Those are not capital offenses, ella ba'azhara, but one has violated a negative commandment, and generally the punishment for a negative commandment, if it is not a capital offense, and if the Torah does not specify what the punishment is, then generally it is stripes. It is stripes, meaning being caned, something like that. And that's what that means. So thank you. I hope this was reasonably clear. Take care. I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to stop the recording.